What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're taking a look at a clip from The Line. If you would like to, please go down below to the description and find a link to The Line and to the live stream that this video clip is coming from. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to The Line. I host over on The Line at least twice a month, so I hope to see you over there. All right. Let's get on into the clip. If you're ready to fuck around and find out what this crazy ass caller's talking about today, then please stay tuned.
Who else we got?
Okay, so we've got Tony from Australia, who's our last caller. He's an atheist too, but he's also not. Yeah, it's pretty late or early, either one over there. But Tony is not convinced of the mythicist position. And so Tony seems to be asking, would Jewish authorities not have attacked the fictionality of Jesus had there not been some historical basis for his existence? So, Tony, do you maybe want to clarify or add anything to like what our show notes have?
Well, sure. First of all, it's a pleasure to meet you both, and thank you for taking my call.
Absolutely. Tony, what time is it over there?
It's 11 a.m.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. I thought it was like, 4 in the morning or something. Okay. Fair enough.
Nope. You've rightly raised some questions about sort of the positive evidence for the existence of Jesus. My question is, let's assume that this character is completely historical. Would there not have been some responses from Jewish authorities? Jewish civilization at that stage was highly literate. They had records. Let's suppose that this guy didn't exist. Wouldn't they have been able to turn around and say, look, this never happened. Nothing even remotely like it ever happened.
And here's the thing. We don't see any evidence that they were doing that. We see the gospel saying things like, oh, well, the Jews just made up this thing, and they tell them that to this day, his followers. But everything we see are reactions to what Christians were preaching. We don't see anything, for instance, we don't see anything from the Romans saying, well, yeah, we crucified this guy, but he was really bad. We see all the Jewish responses we see in like medieval writings and like Byzantine era writings. They are all clearly reacting to what the Christians are preaching. And the closest we get to anything like that is from a Christian writer, his dialogue against Trypho, where he makes up this Jewish character who gives all the Jewish arguments that Christians were facing. And what he has that character say was, well, you Christians clearly invented this guy, because if he had been here, we would know about it. And yet you've made up this figure for yourselves, and for his sake, you're perishing. And
that's an interesting. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No worries. I was just going to add, we do have like pagan criticisms, but everything we get is criticisms of what they're reading in the Gospels and saying, the Sea of Galilee's not that deep. You couldn't have a storm. You can cross it in 2 hours. People like Celsus, who are against the Christians. And the funny thing about that is their arguments still hold up today. They are still spot on. They point out all these impossibilities that would never have happened in these gospel stories. And the Christian responses to them don't deny that, but they start saying, well, yeah, but there's all this great symbolism. And so, it's the theological value is that this represents this and this. But the fact that it couldn't have ever happened, that doesn't bother them at all, because it's so rich in theological wealth and whatever,
Yeah. It is, well, that is one of the. I wasn't aware of sort of the response to Trypho, but I was aware of sort of Celsus's work. Yeah. And, it was interesting when Alfred in the earlier call brought it up, because one of the early pagan criticisms of Christianity was that it was just like every other mystery religion. in particular Apollonius of Tyana or Tyana.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know.
What a perfect figure to bring up, because it's the exact same process that created him is the kind of thing that gave us Jesus. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I have to say, you've because I was going to bring him up as though he were sort of widely, as though Apollonius were widely regarded as a historical figure, but in the time I was on the phone, I had the opportunity to sort of review that question, and the historiography is not as solid as my casual reading would lead me to believe.
But you know what's funny about that, and I'm glad you brought up, is that at least the guys who created Apollonius had the foresight to even half-ass create a historiography for him, even though it doesn't hold up at water. That's more than any of the gospel writers did. That's more than any of the gospel writers did for Jesus. So fair play to him that way. Yeah.
So okay. Well, you've pretty much answered my question. You've just knocked the job on the head. I'll need to look up that response to Trypho. I've been reading some books on early Christianities, and it's really interesting. One of the most it was fascinating to hear Alfred complain about cover-ups when it was the church has put thousands of years into suppressing these alternative ideas, Valentinians, Maronites, these ideas are,
absolutely.
Ideas that, modern Christianity pretends never existed, that Christianity is this monolith, and it never was and it never is. I do think there is an argument to be made that Christianity has engaged in a gigantic cover-up of just how mythological its early beginnings were.
You reminded me of something that is a good example of that, and that's the Nag Hammadi library. That's this collection of writings from the 3rd or 4th century, I forget which, that if we didn't know, if we never found that library, we would have no idea how diverse Christianity was. And we also have an example from the Nag Hammadi Gospels of them taking a pagan religious writing, turning it into a Christian writing, literally cutting and pasting, taking, and Eusebius the Blessed said this, and they turn it into, and Matthew asked Jesus this, and it's like, it's a smoking gun because it's half finished. So it's like, if we could, they've had 2,000 plus years to shave the serial numbers off the bike they stole. But can you imagine if we actually had the original texts from Paul, from Matthew, from Mark? And Bart Ehrman knows this more than anybody else, how all our layers of these early Christian writings are forged, are adjusted, twisted, changed, and we don't know what the original writing was. We have all these different factions changing things to suit them, but we don't really know. Even devout Christian scholars, in some cases, don't know which one is the original reading and which isn't. And I'm not talking about just mistakes and grammar mistakes and scribal errors. I'm talking when they deliberately change something to say the opposite of what it says. And the history of that kind of textual history is really fascinating, and a real, not just one more thorn in the side of Christianity as well.
Yeah, in misquoting Jesus, Ehrman points out that an entire story was written out of the Bible because the monks didn't like it, because Jesus got angry with a.
There's whole genres. I was going to say there's whole genres of infancy gospels that we only have one in the Bible, in Luke, but there was a whole genre of these things that still exist that we have that never made the cut, or were in the cut and then got kicked out later. One more time.
There are two of them. The proto-evangelion of James, and
yes, yeah. I was just talking about the canonical ones, but yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Anyway, also wanted to say that it's a pleasure to finally get to talk to John. You and I have barely let him say a word. but I'm a great admirer of your work. So it's lovely to meet you both, and thank you for taking my call.
No, yeah, thank you for calling in, Tony. And I guess where I wanted to start out with your question here and something I want you to think about is like, if I were to make up that there was like some magical person that was going around, doing magical tricks and claiming to be the son of God, how would you go about like disproving that? Like, if anybody were to start just claiming that, oh, there's some guy going around saying that he's son of God and he can, save your soul and everything. How would you then go about like trying to disprove that? So like whenever you're asking about the Jewish authorities attacking the fictionality of Jesus, like if there were people in the first century that were just running around saying, oh, this guy Jesus died and he resurrected and he absolves our sins, like, how would you, in the first century especially, how would you go about disproving that, for one? And for two, I would think that at that particular time, you'd just be like, what are you talking about? No, that's not, like, you would just, that would be something easily dismissed.
I want to jump in on that because, wait, let me jump in on that real fast because one of my problems with just accepting that there was even just a guy named Jesus, let's take out the magic, just a teacher or a religious figure, political figure, as Jesus is described in the Bible. One of my problems with accepting that is that we do have evidence for these wannabe messiahs in the first century who are much less interesting. There's over a dozen of these guys, like John the Baptist, like the Egyptian mentioned in Paul's letters, Judas the Galilean, you name it, Apollonius Jesus shepherd. There's a whole list of them. None of them are anywhere near as interesting as what Jesus is claimed to be in the Gospels, and yet every single one of these guys made a dent in the historical record. How come Jesus didn't? There's a good example of a way you can falsify that story.
Right. Okay. The gentle pushback I would provide to John's question is that it's not just a matter of sort of somebody claiming that there's somebody going around doing magic. The stories involve the actions, especially the sharp end of the stories, involve actions allegedly undertaken by the by the Sadducees, by the Pharisees. They are characters in these events. And so they have a direct say in whether or not these events happened or whether or not there's
But we don't have any evidence that there was any Jewish responses at the time, any contemporary complaints about it. And also it's worth pointing out that the depiction of the Pharisees in the Gospels is ridiculous. The Pharisees in real life would have loved somebody like Jesus. They hated the Sadducees. They weren't on board. They weren't in cahoots with them. They hated those Roman toadies. They would have loved somebody like Jesus. And in fact, when there's that verse, irony of ironies, when it says, oh, he doesn't teach like the scribes and the Pharisees. Yeah, he does. He teaches exactly like them because they stole some of his teachings directly from the Pharisees. So,
I would go further, and I would say that the alleged interaction between the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities is simply unintelligible. The Roman authorities have no incentive to comply with what the Jewish authorities ask of them. You want him killed, go out and stone him. We're not going to stop you. That seems
just
to be the
like Mosaic law says. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Well, so the point that I would make is that you've got to keep in mind the time frame in which these things are written, right? Because if you look at the very earliest records that we have, that would be Paul's epistles. There's no involvement of the Sadducees. There's no involvement from the greater Jewish community or anything like that. In fact, you can make a solid argument that these revelatory visions that were given to Paul, Peter, and the other apostles at the time were something that was very personal to them and you can make the argument that these visions or whatnot were talking about things that were happening in the heavens. So if they were happening in the heavens, then we wouldn't expect to see any kind of response from the Sadducees or anything like that. The part where the Sadducees come in is much later in the Gospels. And as we see in the early 2nd century church fathers that pop up, they really weren't concerned whatsoever with the historical nature of these narratives, like of the Gospels. They were really just concerned about the message that the Gospels were presenting. And so they felt that metaphorical truth was far greater than any kind of historical truth that could be represented by them. So there wasn't even any concern about the historical nature of any of this stuff until the mid 2nd century or even later in the 3rd century. So, I mean, I think that if you take into consideration the time frame in which these things were written and the progression of the faith, between the 1st century and the 2nd century, I think that you can understand why there's no response from the greater Jewish community at the time.
Tony, I think you're playing a didgeridoo. It sounds like we're getting some didgeridoo music from you.
Yeah, that's somebody mowing their lawn next door. I'm sorry for that. I tried turning off my mic, but I clearly wasn't fast enough. Anyway, thank you both so much. I missed my opportunity. I did want to interrupt John there because I thought this was way too civilized a conversation for the internet. Thank you both so much, and I'll let you get on to any other calls that you've got. Take care.
Thank you so much, Tony.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you, Tony. Well, heathens, that's going to be it for today's clip from The Line. Again, if you would like to subscribe to The Line, their links are in the description, so please go down there and subscribe. And as a reminder, I do host over there at least twice a month on either a Sunday or a Monday. So if you want to see more of me answering questions from callers, please go over to The Line and subscribe. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.